right. Well, thank you so much for that brilliant introduction, Wesley. It's a great pleasure to be here with you guys today. My talk is going to be about the power of networks. It's going to be about the power, but also the beauty of networks, and the challenge of mapping an increasingly complex world. And I'm actually going to start off this talk talking about trees. And trees have been important religious symbols over the ages. We can see trees way back in time, from ancient Babylon to Buddhism, to, of course, Christianity, to Judaism. This is, in fact, the Jewish tree of life, also known as the Kabbalah tree, a beautiful diagram, really expanded throughout the Middle Ages. But trees have not only been important religious symbols, but they have also been really critical knowledge classification systems. We can see trees, and there have been these mapping systems, mapping a variety of topics, mapping the blood ties between people, mapping the main characters in stories told on the Bible, in these beautiful medieval illustrations, mapping the main areas of science. Again, here, Ramon Llull, a Spanish medieval schooler, doing this brilliant depiction of a tree, using the tree metaphor to visualize the many different areas of science. Also mapping the variety of relationships between many of the different species known to man, using, again, the tree metaphor on and on and on. And trees really have become such a widespread metaphor because they really embody this human desire for order, for symmetry, for balance, for unity, for simplicity, for hierarchy. It is really this sort of expression of human nature in many different ways. What you have on the left side is one of the oldest trees of knowledge ever devised. It was actually created by Aristotle himself. And Aristotle basically tried to encapsulate in the tree all the knowledge at the time known to man. So you start off with substance on the very top, and it continuously breaks down, branches out, all the way into the individual human beings in the bottom, so Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle himself. Again, trying to encompass all human knowledge using the tree metaphor, right? But now we are really facing, in many ways, a critical paradigm shift, where trees are really no longer able to accommodate the various complexities, the inherent complexities of the modern world. And this is really a turning point from trees to networks. One of the best articles I've read on this topic that it really explains this paradigm shift was written by scientist Warren Weaver in 1948. And in this article about organized complexity, American scientist Warren Weaver divided modern science into three different stages. The first stage, covering the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, was a period where most scientists were really trying to understand how one element influences the other, to what Weaver considers to be problems of simplicity. Moving forward to the second stage of modern science, covering the first half of the 20th century, scientists became aware that there's not just one or two elements in our planet, in our universe. There's a lot more. But the way that these elements are organized was fairly chaotic, was at least at the time thought to be fairly chaotic or random, to what Weaver considers to be problems of disorganized complexity. Moving, of course, to the third stage of modern science, covering the second half of the last century and the current one where we now, scientists really became aware that it's not just a huge number of elements in our planet, but also they are highly interconnected, highly intertwined, highly interdependent, to what Weaver considers to be problems of organized complexity. And we can really see these problems of organized complexity in a variety of ways. We can see them in the way we try to unravel our ecosystems. So no more we have this extremely simplified predator versus prey diagram in this particular view. This is actually one of the famous diagrams created by Darwin, actually, trying to explain how cats are related to clover, which is pretty interesting if you want to delve into it. But no more we have this really simplified mental model of ecosystems, right? The more we look and the more we study and the more we research the intricacies of our planet, of our ecosystems, we understand they are immensely complex. This is actually a map of close to 100 species that interact with the codfish off the coast of northern eastern Canada. It's really an immensely intricate and complex map that really proves how this notion of a simplified nature is just so outdated. We also see these problems of organized complexity in the ways we try to decode our own brain. So if before we tend to think about the brain as this centralized modular organ where a given area was responsible for a specific set of actions and behaviors, the more we actually, again, research and study the brain, we understand that the brain is not centralized at all. It's not modular at all. It's really almost very similar to a music symphony played by hundreds and thousands of musical instruments. This is actually one of the most complex maps of the human brain. It was created by the Blue Brain Project, which is fairly similar to the Human Genome Project, at least at the same level of complexity, the same level of aspiration. And this is mapping 10,000 neurons and 30 million connections. And it's approximately 10% of the human neocortex. So actually, I saw one of the key directors of this project talking about it. And I think in 10 years' time, they actually plan to have an entire map of the brain, which is really striking if you just want to digest it for a second. We also, of course, see these problems of organized complexity in the ways we also categorize knowledge. And this has been, again, a human aspiration from the beginning of times. We saw how Aristotle himself devised and used a tree model to encompass all the information that he had about the world. Here you see one of the most beautiful tree illustrations, in my view, that really became a really important knowledge classification system in its own right. This was an illustration done in the French Encyclopedia by Diderot and d'Alembert, really the sort of the beacon of enlightenment at the time. This was done in 1751. And this was, again, an illustration, as part of that encyclopedia, was depicting all the areas of knowledge at the time known to man and all the chapters of the encyclopedia itself. And again, using the tree metaphor once again, and using the tree metaphor in the case that branches don't really touch each other, right? It's just there's no ties, there's no connections between branches. It's really using this sort of hierarchical tree metaphor. But of course, as we all know, the internet has been critical in changing this, right? Knowledge is not hierarchical by any means. This is actually two maps of Wikipedia. The left one is mapping the history, the topic of history, and the right one is mapping mathematics. And as you all know, Wikipedia is really one of the largest rhizomatic structures ever created by man. It's really by looking at a lot of these maps and by experiencing Wikipedia, as probably most of you have already, as you navigate through the immensity of hyperlinks, you can see how knowledge is it's highly interdependent, it's highly intertwined, which is, it's not a tree at all. It's really just like a network. And another way we like to look at this sort of paradigm shift, where trees are really losing a lot of its ability to depict the complexities of the modern world, is by looking at the ways we tend to organize ourselves. And this, for ages, especially after the Industrial Revolution, in fact, society in general, but also companies, the army, different institutions, really embrace this highly hierarchical system, where you have the typical organizational chart on the left side, which is mapping the CEO all the way on the top to the individual workman down below. So it's a very sort of top-down structure, right? But of course, human beings, as of course we know, are really much more idiosyncratic creatures. We do not really conform well to this type of highly structured and rigid logic. And of course, the web is also contributing greatly to this change in this paradigm shift. These are two maps of online social collaboration between Perl developers. I think this audience is pretty knowledgeable when it comes to programming. But Perl, for those who don't know, it's a fairly famous programming language. And here you can actually see how a variety, hundreds of people are actually collaborating online to achieve a given project. And here you can see there's no centralized person leading the whole process, right? It's a very flattened out horizontal structure. It's really a network. Finally, we see this, we can see this problems of organized complexity in the way we try to understand, map, and order nature itself. So on the left side, you have this was actually the only illustration. I'm a huge fan of Darwin myself, so I always like to present this particular illustration. This was the only drawing that Darwin had in the original Origin of Species, one of the best, of course, as we all know, scientific books ever made. And this was what he called the tree of life, right? And this was really, really critical for Darwin's ideas on evolution. There's actually several letters of Darwin sending to the publisher saying, you need to have this illustration in the book. It's just critical to my whole sort of ideation, to my whole conception of evolution. And on the right side is the typical sort of top-down structure, taxonomy we use to map every living creature on our planet. So here is actually an interesting comparison between a human being and a fruit fly, all the way from the top, from domain to the genus and the species, right? So, and here you have this, again, highly hierarchical top-down structure to map nature itself. And again, revisiting the original tree of life by Darwin. What's interesting is that fairly recently, scientists discovered that overlaying this tree of life, there is a dense network of bacteria. And if you think about that, roughly 90% of the human body is made of bacteria, you can really understand the relevance of this discovery. And scientists are now calling this, and all this immense, dense network of bacteria is actually tying all these disparate species, right, making them closer together. And scientists are now calling this not the tree of life, but they're calling it the web of life, the network of life. And these have been some of the, the dozens of projects, the dozens and dozens and hundreds of different projects I've been collecting over the last 7 years, as Wesley described, in a project that many of you might already know, visualcomplexity.com. And the goal here has always been to really leverage this critical understanding of the different visualization methods across a variety of disciplines, as diverse as biology, social networks, or the World Wide Web. What you actually read on the bottom is a quote from one of the blogs talking about visual complexity at some point, where it says that in VC, the reader is just as likely to come across a representation of a protein network as they would be to see a map of a subway or a social interaction. And you can really understand this pluralistic, this holistic approach of the project by looking at the variety of categories I've been mapping over the years. From knowledge networks to social networks to art to biology, computer systems, semantic networks, you name it. I'm really trying to understand the holistic approach of mapping networks. And you could easily argue that a project could be made only mapping social networks, and you probably would have plenty of projects to populate that website or blog, and actually a lot of blogs are already doing so. But I feel really that by analyzing this variety of subjects, that's the only way you can really understand how different people in different areas of knowledge are really trying to decode the same similarities across different systems, finding the solutions to a given problem. And of course, when you have such a large data set of projects, inherently, certain topics, certain patterns start emerging from that data set, from that database, right? So what I'm just going to talk a little bit about, very briefly, is some of the popular subjects that have been emerging out of visualcomplexity.com. So the first one is blogosphere, mapping the blogosphere. This has been sort of a long-term goal, and that there's actually a lot of projects in visual complexity trying to decode a lot of these issues. So where you have on number one is actually one of the most popular sort of approaches. It's trying to map the political U.S. blogosphere, and it's trying to map all the connections between Democrats and Republican blogs to see if through that interconnection, this online interconnection to this online discourse, maybe can actually explain, in some extent, the outcome of a given election, right? So it's really interesting that you have this sort of attempt to understand how the virtual world is influencing the real world. So in number two, this goes a really I think a much longer way in many ways. That number two is actually mapping all the blogs that supported Ségolène Royal in the French elections back in 2007. And what's interesting here is that you not only have nodes, sort of randomly placed in the screen, but they actually are attached to specific geo-coordinates to where that blog belongs to, in which area of France. That's why you can actually roughly see the shape of France. What would be really interesting for me is if there was even a third layer with actually the final outcome of that election, then you could really compare how, again, the online discourse, the virtual world is influencing the physical, the real world. And one of my favorite projects mapping the blogosphere is the hyperbolic blogosphere, the one, number 3 on the right side. And this is an attempt to map the most active areas of blog space. So you have major hubs that you can ideally pinpoint. So number 1 right here is dailycost.net, one of the most popular blogs out there. Number 2 is boingboing.net, again, one of the most popular blogs out there. But number 3 is actually something that was really, really intriguing to the author who actually created this visualization. And he was really trying to understand how come is that you have this sort of isolated island from the rest of the blogosphere, right? And it turned out that that isolated island is primarily comprised of LiveJournal users. And LiveJournal, for those who don't know, it's very similar to WordPress or Blogger. But what's interesting about LiveJournal from a social science point of view is that it's primarily comprised of teenagers. And teenagers tend to create a lot of inner links between themselves, but they don't actually create a lot of outbound links with the rest of the world. So you end up having this tightly knit island isolated from the rest of the blogosphere. And this is, again, a really interesting case for the power, for the beautiful aspect of visualization that can really help us creating a lot of insights that otherwise would be impossible to achieve. Flickr, of course, as we all know, has been a remarkable sort of data set for data visualizers to explore and massage and just play around with. There's different aspects of it. So the first one is actually trying to map. This was way back in time when Flickr just emerged. This was trying to map the entire social network within Flickr. And I think the author just gave up after a while, but it was really becoming highly complex. Then number 3 is probably one of my favorite projects using Flickr data. So what the authors did here, this was done in the city of Barcelona, but they have already done it, a similar process in other cities across the world. But what they did is they collected a large chunk of images taken in the city of Barcelona from Flickr, and using only 2 data points, the time that image was taken and the geo-coordinates of that image. And with only those 2 those 2 data points, they could recreate the path that people were making within the city of Barcelona. So what's interesting here is that you're using a very alternative system, a system that's primarily used by people to upload images of their family, their friends, and it's being used in a way that can be highly relevant for the mayor of that city, as you can imagine, or for urban planners of the city of Barcelona to understand how people are using the vast urban landscape of a city. Other trends, other sort of interesting subjects being approached in visual complexity is, of course, literature, right? So mapping test arc, you probably are all familiar with that project, pretty old one, but still very relevant. Mapping all the intricacies between the topics, the subjects, the people in Alice in Wonderland. Mapping all the connections between the people mentioned in the Bible, number 2. But one of the most interesting one is number 3, Emma's node, which is really trying to almost visualize what's for us is a really sort of intricate system, the Amazon recommendation engine, right? People who like this book also like that. So it's really trying to create this ever-evolving network of relationships, of ties between a variety of titles, a variety of books within Amazon. And of course, terrorism has also been a really interesting topic. As of course you all know, many money and energy has been sort of invested in trying to decode, trying to understand many of these mysterious terrorist cells. And one of the reasons that terrorism is such a hard thing to unravel is because it's a really highly non-hierarchical system, right? There's no leader per se. There's no one that knows everything. There's no one in control, as we try to think. And we, of course, project a lot of these ideas because most of our social structures, like the army itself and the government and politics, is based on highly hierarchical top-down structures. But terrorism is everything but that, right? It's a very flattened, non-hierarchical system. There's actually a really interesting book, if you guys are interested in this topic, which is The Starfish and the Spider. And they make this connection between the starfish and the spider in the sense that the spider is the example of a hierarchical structure, right? If you cut the head of the spider, the body dies off immediately. The starfish, in opposition, is a great example of a non-hierarchical, decentralized structure. If you cut the arm of the starfish, it grows it back. Even if you cut the starfish in half, it grows it back, right? So it has this ability to adapt to the environment in a much better way than a spider has. So what's interesting here, and taking that metaphor to terrorism, is that because it is that non-hierarchical structure, because there is no centralized command, it's really hard, of course, for them to decode who's in charge. So visualization is proving to be a fantastic tool to help in that process. The project that you see on number 3 is actually one of my favorite projects, mapping terrorism. So what they did was, this is actually a map trying to, again, understand the terrorist cells involved in the Madrid attacks a few years back. And what they did is actually they divided in different years. So each layer that you see here corresponds to a different year. And then they map all the people that were present in that network year after year. And the blue lines that you see there is actually tying the people that were present year after year across those 3 different layers. So even though there's no leader per se, they can probably understand the people that have been part of this network for a longer period of time. So they probably are the most influential people. At least they probably know more information about that network than any other person on that social structure. So it's really interesting how, again, visualization is becoming a tool to really unravel a lot of these complex systems. What's, of course, really interesting when you, again, also collect so many projects in a large database is that you really see how scientists, designers, artists, when in the process of, again, decoding a lot of these complex systems, we are almost in the process of creating the syntax of a new language, right? The new set of building blocks. And this is almost like a new alphabet, right, for me. And this is actually something that I explored really deeply in my book itself. So in the book, I exposed 15 different typologies for networks. This was a pretty time-consuming project. I basically went through this data set, collected all the projects, and by hand was just looking at all the similarities, all this sort of, and this is, again, looking primarily, if before we looked at certain projects like terrorism or the blogosphere, through the popularity of given subjects, given topics, this is looking at the similarities of projects, but by the visual techniques or the visual methodologies that they use, right? So here you have this sort of new alphabet of building networks, right? And again, I've identified these 15 typologies, but many more are out there and will keep evolving and morphing as we speak. It's really interesting, again, here you can actually see a few of those categories in detail. So here on the very top, you have radial convergence, right? And what's really interesting here is how the first one on the top left is mapping a gene network, a network of genes. The second one, the blue one, is mapping a network of IP addresses, while the third one is mapping a network of Facebook friends. And again, what's really interesting, again, to me is how this, apparently very distinct topics are using the same sort of structure, the same sort of technique and methodology to map, again, these very sort of distinct data sets. And of course, these are just some of those categories, evolving work. But a lot of this you can, of course, see in the book itself. But today I would really like, and because I have a little bit more time than normal, I would really like to talk to you about a commonly forgotten aspect of networks. I would like to talk to you about their inherent and mesmerizing beauty, the inherent beauty of networks. And to do that, we really have to look at the aesthetics of networks through the lens of art and science. As we can all recognize this painting by Van Gogh itself, Starry Night in 1889. Actually, Martin Rothenberg, I guess, would probably be pretty angry because I actually cropped the images so it would fit here. But I'm one of those criminals on the web. But when you look deeply, right? I mean, you look at this, and we all recognize this painting immediately. And if you actually look deeply, closely at the painting itself, you can see how it is comprised of a basic set of elements or building blocks, right? You have, the dot, the line, color, shape, direction, texture, scale, motion. This is actually what Donis Dundes, in a book, A Primer of Visual Literacy, done in 1974, calls the skeletal visual forces, right? All these elements, deconstructing a painting to this, to the very, bare bones. And of course, when combined, all these ingredients can create a variety of recipes of visual techniques, right? And this, can be, things like balance and instability, symmetry and asymmetry, accuracy and distortion, flatness and depth. And the list goes on and on and on. Our book is actually pretty interesting on this topic. But this reductionist effort can really only tell us half the story, right? As we all know, when it comes to painting, when it comes to sculpture, when it comes to music, photography, or cinema, the whole is really always more than the sum of its parts, right? And even though this idea has been with us for centuries, going back to Aristotle himself, which was, apparently it was the first person saying a very similar concept. It was really in the early 20th century that, through the work of the Berlin School of Experimental Psychology, that this idea really became ingrained in our societies, really became sort of solidified in many of us, to what later became known as Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt psychology has been, critical influence in society since then. It has really proved that the operational principle of the brain is ultimately holistic, right? Or in other words, it is irreducible. One of their most famous experiments has been the Gestalt effect, right? Saying that it basically essentially proved that the recognition of shapes and forms is not based on a collection of elements, such as dots or lines, but on seeing them as a fully identifiable pattern. And you can actually see this is one of the most famous, of course, images from Gestalt psychology, the famous dog, right? That in a few seconds we can immediately recognize the dot within the picture, despite of this randomness of dots going on the screen. And in fact, our brain is really so used to identify these familiar shapes that we even tend to find meaningful patterns in meaningless noise, to a pattern to a process that is actually called patternicity, which is a really interesting topic if you guys want to research a little bit more about as well. And as philosopher Karl Popper explains, humans are really born with this propensity to look out for regularities, or with the need to find regularities. But what happens when the sense of order becomes unstable? When we cannot actually perceive any regularity or familiar shape within the screen itself, within this given composition? Well, Ernest Gombrich, art historian, tells us that delight lies somewhere between boredom and confusion. If monotony makes it difficult to attend, a surfeit of novelty would overload the system and cause us to give up. We are not tempted to analyze the crazy pavement. But is this really the case? I mean, can this be the crazy pavement? I mean, why? I mean, how can this actually help us explain, the appealing nature, the compelling nature of networks? Well, to this I will just briefly explore two possible justifications. One of them is the notion of complexity in coding. Perhaps there is a cognitive predisposition for complexity. So whenever, of course, we talk about complex networks, we always go back to a particular art movement called abstract expressionism. And one of its main figures, of course, was Jackson Pollock. What's interesting about Pollock is that there's a lot of resemblance to nature, right, immediately. And this is not actually arbitrary. It's, Pollock himself said that my concern is with the rhythms of nature. I work inside out like nature. And also, physicist Richard Taylor actually spent a long time understanding and analyzing Pollock's paintings. And he came up with a list explaining why Pollock's paintings have so many affinities with nature. And I probably don't have the time to go through this in detail, but you can really understand a lot more of Pollock's paintings if you research on this topic. And of course, by looking at a side-by-side comparison between, in this case, of course, Autumn Rhythm, the painting we just saw, number 30, on the left side, and on the right side, you have a picture, a photograph of oak trees, a forest of oak trees. And again, the resemblance are really striking in many different ways. If you look closely into many of Pollock's patterns, you can also find immense resemblances to street patterns, to urban layouts, as you can see here on the left side from the London GPS map by Tom Carden, or even to the way neurons are structured, to this beautiful image on the right side. But this is probably one of the most striking comparisons for me. Here on the left side, you have number 5 by Jackson Pollock. And on the right side, you have the Blue Brain Project. Again, just a different rendering of that previous project we saw before. And again, mapping the neocortex, the human neocortex. And what is really, really appealing to me here is, coincidentally or not, it's almost as Pollock is actually looking deeply into his own mind, deeply into his own neural network, and really conveying that into the canvas itself. Furthermore, physicist Richard Taylor actually uncovered a lot of, this is really interesting as well, uncovered a lot of fractal properties within many of of Pollock's paintings. And two of them are really pretty obvious. So one of them is the idea of fractal displacement. So Pollock apparently used the same pattern at different spatial locations, right? This was actually really common in many of his paintings. The second one is the notion of fractal scaling. Pollock used the same pattern at different scales or magnifications. What's interesting about this analysis or this comparison with fractals, right, as Richard Taylor investigated a lot of his paintings, is this could actually be leading us to the explanation why we might actually find Pollock's paintings so alluring. And because, of course, fractals are really all around us in nature, from broccoli to snowflakes. Again, Richard Taylor really says that perhaps people are possessed this type of fractal encoding in their minds, right? They have this, again, mental predisposition for fractals, again, which is a really interesting theory to understand Pollock a little bit better as well. What about networks? I mean, we could arguably see the same pattern happening for networks. If fractals are everywhere, networks are also everywhere, right? So the brain is a network of nerve cells, as we all know. Societies are networks of people. On a larger scale, food webs and ecosystems are represented as networks of species. Networks really also, of course, pervade technology, from the internet, power grids, transportation systems. Networks are truly, truly this omnipresent structure, this omnipresent topology. So perhaps, and this is again, highly speculative in nature, I'm definitely aware of that, but it could be a really interesting hypothesis to understand why we could actually find networks so appealing, so alluring. Perhaps that we have maybe a propensity to structures that are similar to our own brain at its most basic cellular level. So this is one possibility, right? Grasping a lot of the work from Richard Taylor. The second one is the idea of ordered complexity and the idea of unity in diversity. So for hundreds of years, order and complexity have always been opposite sides of the spectrum. Furthermore, order has always been almost like a parallel to beauty, right? We can go all the way back to Aristotle, who considered order, symmetry, and definiteness to be the general elements of beauty. Of course, as we all know, Cubism and Futurism really started changing a lot of those ideas on balanced beauty, right? They really changed a lot of our understanding of this preconception. But of course, this change really took time. It was really not overnight. Many artists, of course, continued to be the target of criticism. And of course, Pollock was probably the easiest target of all. In 1957, psychologist Rodolphe Arnhem wrote a really interesting essay called Accident and the Necessity of Art. And here he writes really strongly against artists like Pollock, who deliberately rely on accident for the production of their work. At the time, during the same time, of course, science was actually going through a very similar dilemma. They were, where order and complexity were still opposite sides of the spectrum. As Richard Taylor actually explains in this brilliant quote, although the individual actions of nature were expected to be pretty simple, it was assumed that the sheer number and variety of actions caused the combined system to descend into disorder, or in other words, complexity was thought to exclude any hope of order. As we all know, the work of Turin, Lorenz, Mandelbrot has been critical in that shift, right? In really conveying and translating nature's apparent disorder into really simple mathematical equations, which led, of course, to the emergence of new scientific domains such as chaos theory, fractal theory, and emergence. And it soon, of course, became widely accepted that the ordered complexity of natural systems relies on basic rules coming together in a variety of shapes and schemas. We can see this ordered complexity in swarm behavior, right? This highly synchronized movement of large groups of animals, which are actually based on very simple local rules. This is a beautiful illustration, beautiful piece of bird flocking by Robert Ogden, right? A beautiful piece that he has made. And of course, this is a very similar process underlies most generative art projects. We have seen plenty of them today and yesterday, where in most cases, virtual ants or agents are told to move in various directions across the screen and leaving behind their various trails, right? So, a lot of this work caused, of course, caused order and complexity to become a lot closer, as we all know. In fact, we now have a lot of new labels. We're calling them orderly disorder, orderly complexity, to really encompass this new union of order and complexity. now we understand they are not at the end of the spectrum anymore. They are actually all intertwined, order and complexity. And this new idea of ordered complexity is really changing and influence a new formula of beauty, a new conception of beauty, which Ralph Lauren calls the idea of unity in diversity. And this idea is really central to this new explanation for how networks can be so alluring, right? So what's interesting about networks is that they are this critical element of this new conception of beauty, right? In many ways, despite their rich diversity and multiplicity, there is this holistic sense of unity in the network, what Ruth Lauren considers to be this unity in diversity. And it could, again, this could really be the second key explanation for the compelling nature of networks. And because of those traits of networks, and because of the work that scientists, designers, artists have been making over the years, this has been really contaminating a lot of traditional artists from traditional fields like painting and sculpture. And networks are really becoming almost a cultural meme in its own right. So are we actually in the presence of a new movement of networkism? So here are some of really interesting comparisons. So on the left side, you have IP mapping, a computer-generated map of IP addresses. And on the right side, you have transient structures and unstable networks, a beautiful, beautiful painting by Sharon Malloy. And again, the comparisons are pretty striking in many ways. Here, on the left side, you have a computer-generated social network, Operation Smile. And on the right side, you have Field 4 by Emma McNally, using graphite on paper. And it's really, again, interesting that you see these remarkable similarities between both projects. And Sharon Malloy has this brilliant quote. Sharon Malloy is really one of the key precursors of this new movement. And Sharon Malloy says that my quest is to reveal how everything is interconnected, from the atom to the cell to the body and behind into society and the cosmos. There are underlying processes, structures and rhythms that are mirrored all around and permeate reality. So this is really the central motivation of a lot of these new artists. They're really trying to, through their paintings, through their sculptures, really trying to unravel this new complexity, this new understanding of systems. And what's interesting here is that this could actually be taken from one of Alfred Barabassi's books or any physicist talking about networks. It has that same level of aspiration. These are another two different pieces from Sharon Malloy. Again, transient structures and unstable networks, all an animal on canvas. And here you have, again, two brilliant pieces by Emma McNally, graphite on paper. I mean, here it's really, I think, especially on Emma McNally's work, the influence from the network, from network visualization is really, really striking. It's really, it's pretty obvious. But of course, networkism doesn't really happen only in two dimensions. This has to be one of my favorite projects of this movement. And the title really says it all. It's called Galaxies Forming Along Filaments Like Droplets Along the Strands of a Spider's Web. And I've actually never been into one of these installations, but apparently it's made of elastic ropes. So what's interesting is that as you bounce in one of those elastic ropes, the whole network kind of shivers. It kind of like adapts, it almost morphs into that particular movement. So really inheriting a lot of those qualities of many networks. And of course, Japanese artist Chiharu Shiota really takes networkism to a whole different level. She fills entire rooms with this dense web of black woolen thread, right? Sometimes containing objects, sometimes even containing people. This is, remarkable project. So of course I would just, I normally like to end some of my talks with this, a little bit of a teaser. Is there such a thing as a universal structure? So the project that you have on the left side, it's a neural network of a mouse, which is at this scale pretty similar to our own. And on the right side, you have the Millennium Simulation. It was the largest and most realistic simulation of the growth of cosmic structure and the formation of galaxies. It was able to recreate the evolutionary history of approximately 20 million galaxies in 25 terabytes of stored output. And here you have the same comparison, the same neural network of a mouse, just at a different scale, and the same millennium of simulation at just a different scale. And coincidentally or not, I just found this resemblance so striking in so many different levels. How, the smallest scale of human knowledge, the brain itself, and the largest scale of human knowledge, the universe itself, and how everything is really so similar. All the structure, are we in the presence of this universal topology, this universal structure? And just a little bit of, I guess, self-promotion. A lot of this content is, of course, available in the book Visual Complexity. I'm actually going to do a book signing session just after this talk, so you guys are more welcome to come and join me. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure.